There was a point in human history when our ancestors came dangerously close to disappearing. Not metaphorically, not there weren't many of us. I mean, the human population may have gotten frighteningly small, and somehow the people who made it through became the ancestors of everyone alive today. So what happened? What nearly wiped us out? Here's the strange thing about that question. There isn't a giant grave somewhere waiting to tell us the answer. No enormous pile of human bones. No abandoned city with a sign saying, "This is where humanity almost ended." The evidence is much harder to see. It's in our DNA. Every human alive today carries roughly the same basic genetic blueprint. We're incredibly similar to one another genetically. In fact, humans have relatively little genetic diversity compared with several other great apes, which is one reason scientists have long suspected that our ancestors went through periods when their effective population was small. And that's where things get interesting. Every generation, DNA picks up new mutations. Most do nothing. Some disappear, some get passed on. And over enormous amounts of time, those little differences accumulate. That variation gives geneticists clues about the history of a population. If a population stays large for a long time, it tends to preserve more genetic variation. But if the population crashes, a lot of that variation disappears with it. That's called a population bottleneck, and once genetic diversity is lost, you can't simply get it back overnight. It has to accumulate again through generations of mutation and reproduction, so you don't necessarily need to find the people who died. Their absence can still leave a signature in the people who survived. But there's one important catch. When you hear that ancient humans supposedly dropped to a few thousand people, don't picture a census. Scientists often mean effective population size. And that's not the same thing as the actual number of people walking around. Effective population size is a genetic measure, roughly the size of an idealized population that would produce the genetic patterns we're observing. Real populations are messy. Some people have lots of children, some have none. Groups split apart, groups mix again. Entire family lines disappear. All of that can make the effective population size much smaller than the actual number of people alive. So, when you hear a number like 1,280, don't imagine 1,280 humans standing around a campfire. The real population could have been considerably larger, and that distinction becomes very important. So here's the evidence. Humans have surprisingly low genetic diversity for a species that's now spread across almost every environment on Earth. Two people from opposite sides of the planet can be genetically more similar than you'd expect from a species of more than 8 billion people. And compared with chimpanzees, humans have substantially less genetic variation overall. Think about that. 8 billion people, every continent, every climate, thousands of languages, and yet, genetically speaking, we're a remarkably narrow branch of the ape family. That doesn't tell us exactly when the bottleneck happened, but it tells us that something in our deep past left a mark. So what was it? For years, there was one famous answer. You've probably heard it. Around 74,000 years ago, one of the biggest volcanic eruptions in Earth's recent geological history happened at Toba on the island of Sumatra. It was enormous. The eruption produced thousands of cubic kilometers of volcanic material and spread ash across huge parts of Asia. The USGS describes Toba as the largest eruption of the last 2 million years. And for years, scientists wondered whether this eruption had nearly destroyed humanity. In the late 1990s, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed that Toba triggered an enormous volcanic winter. The basic story was terrifyingly simple. The volcano erupts, the climate cools, plants struggle, food disappears, humans starve, the population crashes. And suddenly, the genetic bottleneck makes sense. It's a fantastic story. One catastrophe, one cause, one explanation for why humans ended up with so little genetic diversity. There's just one problem. The evidence doesn't fit that story nearly as neatly as it once seemed. At Jwalapuram in southern India, researchers found stone tools both below and above the Toba ash layer. The technology showed substantial continuity across the eruption. And another site in India, Daba, shows evidence of long-term human occupation spanning the Toba eruption, with the stone tool tradition continuing across the event. In South Africa, researchers found microscopic Toba glass shards in archaeological sites and evidence that humans in the region continued living there through the eruption and the colder conditions that followed. Then there's Lake Malawi. Researchers drilled into its sediments and looked for evidence of the catastrophic climate change that the classic Toba theory required. What they found didn't look like the kind of dramatic environmental collapse the theory predicted. One study concluded there was no evidence that Toba produced the devastating volcanic winter once proposed, and found no support for a genetic bottleneck caused by the eruption. So the volcano was real. It was gigantic. Its effects on the environment were real too. But the idea that Toba almost wiped out humanity? That's no longer the straightforward answer it used to be. And that's actually where the story gets more interesting. Because if Toba didn't nearly destroy us, the genetic evidence still needs explaining. In 2023, a team of researchers published a study in Science using a new computational method to reconstruct ancient human population history from modern genomes. Their result was startling. They estimated that human ancestors went through an extremely severe bottleneck roughly 930,000 to 813,000 years ago. Their model estimated an effective population of about 1,280 breeding individuals, and they estimated that this period lasted roughly 117,000 years. Read that number again. 1,280, not 8 billion, not 8 million, not even 100,000, about 1,300 breeding individuals in the model, for more than 100,000 years. If that reconstruction is right, our ancestors weren't simply having a rough century. They were hanging on through an enormous stretch of evolutionary history. But, and this matters, the study does not mean that exactly 1,280 humans were physically alive on Earth. It estimated effective population size. And other researchers have raised concerns about whether the method can distinguish a genuine dramatic bottleneck from more complicated population histories involving groups splitting apart, mixing and changing size over time. So this isn't settled science. The result is fascinating, but it isn't a photograph of humanity standing on the edge of extinction. It's a mathematical reconstruction of our deep population history. And scientists are still arguing about what that reconstruction actually means. But step back from the argument for a second, because there is something both sides can agree on. Our ancestors went through major population changes, and humans have spent enormous amounts of evolutionary history living in relatively small, scattered groups. Not one giant civilization, not millions of people packed together. Small communities, separated populations, people moving across landscapes where food wasn't guaranteed, and one bad stretch could matter enormously. And that's a very different kind of survival story. We like to imagine extinction as one dramatic event. A volcano, a meteor, one giant disaster. But populations don't always disappear that way. Sometimes they're slowly squeezed. A few people die here. A group disappears there. A drought lasts longer than expected. Food becomes harder to find. A population gets split apart. A disease moves through. A generation has fewer children. Then another. And another. Nobody knows they're living through a bottleneck. There's no newspaper. No historian writing down what happened. People are just trying to survive. And thousands of years later, their descendants are carrying the evidence. There's another part of this that gets really weird. Your family tree. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, keep doubling. After 40 generations, the simple mathematical tree gives you more than 1 trillion ancestor positions. But around 1,000 years ago, there weren't anything close to 1 trillion humans alive. So obviously the tree can't actually keep expanding like that. It folds back on itself. The same ancestors appear in multiple branches. People who were distant cousins had children together, and their shared ancestors show up again and again. That's called pedigree collapse. And the further back you go, the more tangled the tree becomes. Eventually, the idea of your family starts getting weird, because the deeper you go, your ancestors aren't just your ancestors. They're connected to everyone else's. Go far enough back and the tree doesn't look like a tree anymore. It looks like a web. And somewhere inside that web are the people who survived whatever population crashes our ancestors went through. Every person in your direct ancestral chain had to survive long enough to reproduce. Not most of them. Every single one. If even one link had disappeared without leaving descendants, you wouldn't be here. And that chain stretches back through hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of generations. You are the end of a line that somehow never broke. Think about that for a second. Before you were born, there were countless moments when your existence could have ended before it ever began. An ancestor could have died young. A child could have been born, but never survived. A population could have disappeared. A family line could have ended, but yours didn't. It kept going, over and over and over again, until eventually you showed up. So what nearly wiped out humanity? The honest answer is, we don't know for sure. We can see evidence that our ancestors went through severe population changes. We can see the genetic consequences. We can build models. We can argue about dates and numbers. But we can't point to one place and say, that's where humanity almost ended. And that's what makes this story so strange. The event, or events, that shaped our deepest population history didn't leave us a monument. No ruins, no written account, no ancient warning carved into stone, just a faint signal in our DNA. A species that survived, a population that changed, and billions of people who came afterward, including you. So maybe the strangest thing isn't that humanity nearly disappeared, maybe it's that, somehow, the line never completely broke. And the people who made it through became all of us.